Hey everyone, Fluffy the Kami here, and today I decided I would go over a few FF14 terms that the community tends to use to describe certain aspects of our combat. I decided to make this video after I made the Samurai Guide, and I got a lot of comments from new players saying they didn't understand a lot of the terms I was using, and that made the guide a little too advanced for them. So we're going to go through all of the terms I know of and expand on them so that the next time you see them, they're a bit easier to digest. First, we're going to start with the two terms GCD and OGCD. GCD stands for Global Cooldown, and this refers to the recast time that most of your skills will be sharing on your job. Generally, the kind of skills that will be affected by this are called weapon skills or spells, and you can check this on your own by hovering over any skill to see the description that describes it. The GCD for every job has a standard recast time of 2.5 seconds, meaning you can use these skills again after you've pressed them in 2.5 seconds. Many jobs have different mechanics that allow them to manipulate this recast time, but that's a little too specific and you can find that out on your own job. One last note is your skill speed and your spell speed affect the global cooldown. Skill speed is for weapon skills and spell speed is for spells. The more you have, the more you lower your recast. Simple. You then have the OGCDs, and with the O standing for off. Off global cooldowns are used to describe skills that are not affected by the global cooldown's recast time, skill and spell speed, or any haste buffs provided by a specific job. You can identify an OGCD in many ways. For one, OGCDs are used in between the recast time of GCD skills, hence the name off global cooldown. These are generally referred to in the game's skill description box as an ability, and is usually pretty consistent as to what an OGCD is. There are very few abilities that break these general rules, but some jobs have some special, unique cases. I implore you to play around with the job and watch guides to find out what unique situations your job might put you into. When you hear the term cooldown, you can also interpret that in a couple different ways. If someone asks you what the cooldown of an ability is, they want to know the recast time for that ability. However, if you are a tank, someone may tell you to use a cooldown. This generally means use one of your defensive abilities. Slightly related to that, if you're a tank, you generally have a powerful defensive cooldown that you gain access to at level 50. Generally in the community, we call this an invuln, as it allows you to basically cheat death in some way, shape, or form. You might want to use this for something like a tank buster. Now let's talk about combos. This one is pretty simple and consistent across all jobs except one, which we'll get into. Combos are formed when you have a weapon skill specifically that allows you to execute another weapon skill with all of its benefits. For example, let's look at three of Samurai's weapon skills, Hakaze, Jinpu, and Gecko. Hakaze on its own is just a normal GCD. However, if you look at Jinpu in its description, it describes Hakaze as its combo action. Gecko also does the same thing for Jinpu, but there is a catch concerning Jinpu and Gecko. Because Hakaze has no requirements out of it, you can use it and always receive the additional effect to gain access to Jinpu. However, you cannot skip Hakaze altogether, go straight to Jinpu, and expect to get the combo bonus to get a Gecko. That's not how it works. The simple answer is you always have to start from the beginning of the chain to get the entire combo to work for you. Combos also vary in length, in which I refer to as tiers. Some combos are 2 tiers, meaning they have 2 different weapon skills to go through, and some combos can reach up to 5 in length. When referring to the term positional, that means that a certain skill, weapon skill, or ability has a requirement based on their target ring, and you can find out whether it's a flank attack or a rear attack by reading the tooltip. If it's rear, you hit from the back of the empty spot of the target ring, and if it's flank, you hit on the sides of the target ring. A useful tip is that you want to think of the ring as 4 quadrants in which you can hit instead of 4 specific spots, as you can hit it anywhere in that quadrant and still get you directional requirements. And finally, since there's one little snowflake left, we must talk about Monk and its stances. Monks don't actually have a single combo unlike most disciples of War. Monk has stances, and to put it sweetly, all of its weapon skills activate a stance that allow it to use a new set of weapon skills. Monk is the only job that can manipulate these stances so that it can use any weapon skill it wants first. So it gets to cheat some rules. For example, instead of always having to start with Boot Shine, You can use the skill form shift to go into a different stance that allows you to use twin sticks first, which is generally what you would think is the second tier of the combo. So yeah, Monk gets to cheat a little bit. Now we get to potencies, and this is the more number crunchy mathematical part of 14, where we use to figure out how much damage a certain skill can do. If a skill deals damage, it will be told on the hover description how much potency it has. Simply put, the higher the potency, the more damage it deals. Any move with a potency can also be affected by buffs. Buffs are basically anything capable of appearing on your buff bar, and that should always be available depending on where you've placed it on your HUD. Buffs do all kinds of things, but if you ever want to know what a buff does, you can hover your mouse over the buff bar or hover over the actual skill that provides that buff. You can also see debuffs, and those may or may not by default be separated from your normal buff bar. But regardless, the debuffs are usually detrimental to you in some kind of way or indicate that you have a certain boss mechanic. A good note is that if a debuff has a white line under it, it's assuneable, meaning a healer can use the skill Asuna to remove it. You can also hover a debuff to get some description about it, but if it's a boss mechanic, don't expect to get away with an explanation of how exactly it works. There's also a general saying that you may want to line up something with buffs or raid buffs. So what does this mean? Well, what people are trying to help you achieve is that you want to apply some of your powerful skills in buffs, provided not only by yourself, but potentially by other players as well. Another term we can touch on related to this is raid buffs. These are typically buffs that apply to the whole party. It's most likely called raid due to how MMOs in the past referred to a party, but you can also call them party buffs to make it more easy to understand in 14 terms. But if you ever see raid and another term behind it, it's usually referring to something that applies to the whole party. Finally, in buff terminology, we have another term called stacks. Stacks is used to refer to a buff that can build upon itself multiple times over, that grants a continuous great effect. For example, on Monk, you can build Grease Lightning 4 times to get the 10% damage buff 4 times, and the 5% haste buff 4 times, equaling 4 stacks of Grease Lightning or Grease Lightning 4. Next up is RNG. RNG stands for Random Number Generator, and we basically use this term to describe any random element of the game. Maybe the boss has 3 patterns for a fight, and it's RNG on what pattern he does every time he pulls. RNG is just a synonym for random, basically. Speaking of RNG, while not necessarily exclusive to the element of RNG, the term proc is used to describe when a buff becomes available due to certain conditions. For the RNG side of things, you can think of Pitch Perfect from Bard and Forbidden Chakra from Monk. From the non-side of RNG, you can think of Third Eye from Samurai, where, as long as you are hit when the Third Eye is active, you get the Open Eyes buff every time. Moving on to the next term, when someone mentions AoE, that means Area of Effect, and that can be used in a multitude of ways. When a boss uses an AoE, it's usually shown as a visual indicator. We all know the big orange circles and not to stand in them, but they can all be boss unique visuals as well. People also say AoE when referring to skills you as a player will have that hit multiple targets. So when someone says, AoE these mobs next pull in your dungeon, that means you want to use your AoE skills to take down the loads of enemies you're most likely pulling. When considering AoE, a select amount of job AoE skills also are subject to the term fall off. Fall off basically means that your AoE skills deal slightly less damage the more targets there are, usually cutting off at a certain point. When someone mentions dot or hot, that means something that does damage over time and healing over time respectively. Hots can also be referred to as regens too, and as you're basically regenerating HP over time. Uptime and downtime are very simple concepts. We use uptime to describe the amount of time available to hit an enemy or the boss. Downtime is used to describe when you cannot hit the boss. And last but certainly not least, we have the two terms rotation and opener. Rotation is basically the typical flow that a job that takes to go through its mechanics. For example, on Warrior, you might use Storm's Eye first, and then you use your inner release, and then you use Storm's Path until you need to refresh Storm's Eye again. That's your basic rotation. And then an opener is basically a subset of that. You use your opener at the very start of the fight, and because you have all your cooldowns up, it usually means you're doing as much damage as possible in a little window, and then the rotation just kind of flows after that. Well, that's basically all I could think of for 14 combat terminology, but I'm sure I missed something. If you have anything I missed, go ahead and drop them down in the comments, and if you need an elaborate response or just have any questions in general, don't be afraid to ask them down below. Remember to like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.